One vitamin deficiency remarkably common in men over 50 is linked in research to weaker erections, low energy, and poor sleep, all three simultaneously, and almost nobody has ever explained this connection clearly. Vitamin D isn't just about bone health. The way most people were taught to think about it growing up, it functions considerably more like a hormone precursor than a traditional vitamin, influencing systems throughout the entire body that most men have never once connected back to a single overlooked nutrient. Today, we're reviewing exactly what the evidence actually shows about vitamin D's connection to these three specific concerns, why deficiency becomes so widespread with age, and precisely how to correct it correctly. Because timing, dosage, and supplement form all genuinely matter here in ways most online advice glosses over entirely. Vitamin D receptors exist throughout vascular tissue, testicular tissue, and specific regions of the brain directly involved in regulating sleep, which is precisely why a genuine deficiency rarely shows up as a single isolated symptom that's easy to trace back to its actual cause. Instead, it tends to present as a cluster of seemingly unrelated complaints all appearing together: persistent fatigue that doesn't resolve with rest, disrupted or shallow sleep that leaves you waking up tired despite spending adequate hours in bed, and reduced erectile function that most men quietly attribute to stress or simple aging rather than a correctable nutrient gap. Understanding this single mechanism, that vitamin D functions as a foundational input into multiple, entirely separate physiological systems simultaneously, is what makes the rest of this video make sense as a coherent picture rather than three unrelated claims stitched together for the sake of a catchy title. Before going any further, a brief but important note that applies throughout everything discussed in this video. Vitamin D toxicity is genuinely uncommon, but it is possible, particularly with excessive unmonitored supplementation or when multiple supplements containing vitamin D are combined without anyone actually tracking the total daily intake being consumed across all of them. Testing your levels before starting supplementation and retesting periodically once you begin represents the safest, most evidence-based approach discussed throughout this entire video, rather than guessing at an appropriate dose based on generic advice found online that has no idea what your actual starting levels look like. Vitamin D deficiency is genuinely widespread among men over 50, and this isn't a coincidence or a fluke of modern diet. It's driven by several distinct factors that converge and compound on one another as men move through this particular stage of life. Skin becomes measurably less efficient at converting sunlight into usable vitamin D as we age, meaning the exact same amount of sun exposure that generated adequate levels at 30 produces considerably less benefit at 50 or 60. Layered on top of that biological reality is a simple lifestyle pattern. Most men in this age range spend the overwhelming majority of their daylight hours indoors, at work, commuting, or simply going about a modern routine that involves far less direct sun exposure than earlier generations experienced as a matter of course. Geography compounds this further still. Men living at higher latitudes or anywhere that experiences genuinely long winters often cannot produce meaningful vitamin D from sunlight alone for large stretches of the year, regardless of how much time they might otherwise spend outdoors during those specific months. And widespread, genuinely important sunscreen use, which absolutely matters for skin cancer prevention and shouldn't be abandoned, does measurably reduce the skin's vitamin D synthesis at the same time, creating an unavoidable trade-off most people have never had explained to them clearly. Taken together, these overlapping factors explain why population-level studies consistently find a substantial percentage of men in this exact age group sitting well below optimal vitamin D levels, frequently without any symptoms severe or specific enough to prompt anyone to actually test for it in the first place. Erectile function depends fundamentally on healthy blood vessel function, specifically the capacity of those vessels to relax on demand and permit a rapid, substantial increase in blood flow into the erectile tissue. Vitamin D plays a genuinely direct, measurable role in supporting this exact process, both through its support of the endothelium, the delicate cellular lining found inside every blood vessel throughout your body, and through its role in supporting healthy nitric oxide production, the very same molecule that standard erectile dysfunction medications are specifically designed to target and amplify. Multiple studies examining men experiencing erectile dysfunction have consistently found meaningfully higher rates of vitamin D deficiency among that specific population compared to men without erectile difficulty, and some research has gone a step further, finding that the severity of vitamin D deficiency actually correlates with the severity of reported erectile dysfunction symptoms, meaning men with more pronounced deficiency tended to report more significant difficulty than men with only mild deficiency. It's worth being genuinely precise about what this research does and does not establish, since I never want to oversell a finding regardless of how promising it initially looks. This represents association drawn primarily from observational research, not confirmed direct causation, established through large randomized controlled trials, specifically measuring erectile function as a primary outcome. Vitamin D deficiency is very unlikely to be the sole cause in most men experiencing erectile dysfunction, which frequently involves several contributing factors working together simultaneously: cardiovascular health, blood sugar regulation, testosterone levels, and psychological stress among them. But given how directly vitamin D supports the exact vascular mechanisms this entire process depends on, correcting a genuine confirmed deficiency represents one of the more straightforward, low-risk interventions available, and one that's frequently skipped over entirely in favor of jumping straight to medication without ever checking this simpler foundational piece first. We're now roughly halfway through this video, and this represents a meaningful shift in what we're discussing. Everything covered up to this point establishes why vitamin D matters and why deficiency has become so common in this specific age group. What follows moves into considerably more practical territory: exactly how to correct a deficiency safely and effectively, since incorrect use, whether through poor timing, an inadequate supplement form, or excessive dosing without proper monitoring, can meaningfully reduce the benefit you're actually looking for, or in rarer cases, introduce genuine risk worth understanding clearly before you start. Research has consistently found that men maintaining adequate vitamin D levels tend to show measurably higher testosterone levels compared to men who are deficient, and several intervention studies specifically found that correcting a genuine confirmed deficiency through supplementation produced modest but real increases in testosterone over a period of several months. This effect appears most pronounced specifically in men who were meaningfully deficient to begin with, rather than men who already maintained adequate levels before starting supplementation, an important distinction worth understanding clearly, since supplementing without an actual confirmed deficiency shows considerably less benefit across the available research. This is precisely why testing your own levels directly, rather than simply assuming you need supplementation based on symptoms alone, genuinely matters here. Beyond this direct hormonal connection, vitamin D deficiency is also independently linked to persistent fatigue and low energy through its broader role in mitochondrial function, the cellular machinery responsible for actually generating usable energy throughout every tissue in your body. Men who successfully correct a genuine deficiency frequently report improved energy within a matter of weeks, sometimes even before follow-up blood work would technically be expected to reflect the full extent of that improvement, which suggests the underlying mechanism genuinely extends beyond hormonal changes alone and into more fundamental cellular energy production processes. Vitamin D receptors exist in specific areas of the brain directly involved in regulating your sleep-wake cycle, and research has consistently found meaningful associations between vitamin D deficiency and both reduced sleep quality and shorter overall sleep duration. This is part of why correcting a confirmed deficiency has been linked across multiple studies to genuinely improved sleep, including more time spent in the deeper, more restorative stages of sleep that matter most for physical and hormonal recovery overnight. However, I want to address something directly here because it genuinely affects exactly how you should be taking this supplement. And it's an area where a lot of circulating online advice actually gets things backwards. Some research suggests that taking vitamin D too close to bedtime specifically may, for certain individuals, interfere with normal melatonin production, since vitamin D and melatonin share some overlapping regulatory pathways within the brain. This means the common, frequently repeated advice to simply take your vitamin D supplement right before bed isn't necessarily the optimal approach for every single person. Some men actually report noticeably better sleep outcomes when they shift their vitamin D intake earlier in the day instead, paired with a meal containing some dietary fat to meaningfully improve absorption, given that vitamin D is a fat-soluble nutrient. My practical guidance here is straightforward. If you've been taking vitamin D before bed and haven't personally noticed any negative effect on your sleep, there's genuinely no strong reason to change that timing simply because of this general research finding. But if you've noticed any new difficulty falling asleep, specifically since starting a nighttime dose, shifting the timing to morning or early afternoon alongside a meal represents a reasonable low-effort adjustment worth trying. Before continuing further, if you want a broader framework connecting vitamin D alongside testosterone, sleep quality, and strength training into one coherent picture, Dr. Emily Carter's guide, The Iron Age, the complete blueprint to reclaiming testosterone strength at vitality after 40, was written specifically to cover exactly these interconnected topics across 9 focused chapters within a concise 14-page format. It's priced at $49.99, and you can find the link provided directly with this video. It's educational in nature, not a replacement for individualized medical care, but it offers a genuinely clear framework for identifying and correcting overlooked gaps just like the one discussed throughout this entire video. I always tell patients that the single most important step here is obtaining an actual blood test, specifically what's called a 25-hydroxyvitamin D test, rather than simply assuming you're deficient based on symptoms alone and starting a supplement blindly without any real baseline to work from. This particular test is genuinely inexpensive and widely available through most standard blood work panels, provided you or your doctor specifically requests it, since it isn't automatically included in most routine annual physicals by default. For men who are found to be genuinely deficient through actual testing, typical supplementation protocols generally range from 1,000 to 4,000 international units daily, though this should always be guided directly by your specific test results and your doctor's individual recommendation, since meaningfully higher doses are sometimes used short-term under proper medical supervision for cases involving more severe deficiency. Taking your vitamin D supplement alongside a meal that contains some dietary fat meaningfully improves how well your body actually absorbs it, given that it's a fat-soluble nutrient that's genuinely poorly absorbed when taken entirely on an empty stomach. Retesting your levels after roughly 2 to 3 months of consistent, appropriately dosed supplementation represents a reasonable, worthwhile way to confirm your levels have actually improved as expected, rather than simply assuming a supplement is working without ever verifying that assumption through follow-up blood work. Something practical that trips up a considerable number of patients involves the simple reality that not all vitamin D supplements sold commercially are created equal, and understanding this distinction genuinely matters if your goal is actually correcting a confirmed deficiency effectively, rather than just going through the motions of taking a daily pill. Vitamin D supplements generally come in two distinct forms, D2 and D3, and research consistently shows that D3, also known as cholecalciferol, is meaningfully more effective at both raising and subsequently maintaining healthy blood levels compared to D2, also known as ergocalciferol. Checking specifically for D3 on the product label is worth the small extra effort involved, since D2 products, while not inherently harmful, tend to require considerably higher doses to achieve a comparable effect and don't sustain elevated blood levels nearly as consistently over time. Beyond this D2 versus D3 distinction, I generally recommend that patients choose reasonably reputable brands that have undergone some form of third-party testing, since supplement regulation overall is considerably less rigorous than pharmaceutical regulation, and genuine product quality can vary meaningfully between different manufacturers selling what appears, on the surface, to be an identical product. Vitamin D doesn't function in complete isolation within the body, and understanding this matters for anyone hoping to see a truly complete response from supplementation alone. Magnesium is genuinely required for the enzymatic processes responsible for converting vitamin D into its biologically active form once it's been absorbed, meaning men who happen to be simultaneously deficient in magnesium, which is also fairly common, particularly among men consuming a diet relatively heavy in processed foods, may find that vitamin D supplementation alone produces a noticeably less complete response than they were expecting, simply because their body lacks adequate magnesium to fully activate and utilize the vitamin D being supplied. Vitamin K2 also plays a genuinely supporting role here, helping direct absorbed calcium toward bone tissue rather than soft tissue throughout the body, which becomes considerably more relevant specifically at higher vitamin D doses that meaningfully increase overall calcium absorption. None of this is meant to complicate what should genuinely be a fairly simple intervention. It's meant to explain clearly why some men report only a partial response to vitamin D supplementation taken entirely on its own, and why discussing the broader nutritional picture with your doctor, rather than fixating narrowly on a single isolated nutrient in complete isolation, tends to produce more complete, genuinely satisfying results over time. For men dealing with a genuinely confirmed, significant deficiency, meaningful improvement in overall energy and mood often becomes noticeable within roughly 3 to 6 weeks of consistent, appropriately dosed supplementation. Sleep quality improvements tend to follow a broadly similar general timeline, though this can vary somewhat between individuals, depending on what other factors might simultaneously be affecting their sleep beyond vitamin D status alone. Erectile function improvements specifically, tied to the comparatively slower physiological process of genuinely improving vascular health and endothelial function over time, typically take somewhat longer to become noticeable, often falling somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 months of consistent supplementation, though some men do report improvement sooner than that general timeline. None of this happens overnight, and I want to be genuinely clear that correcting a vitamin D deficiency is not intended as a substitute for more immediate support if you're currently dealing with significant, genuinely distressing erectile dysfunction right now. It represents a foundational piece worth addressing alongside whatever more immediate support your doctor may separately recommend, not a replacement for that broader conversation entirely. I also want to directly address the other end of this entire conversation, because more is genuinely not always better here. And vitamin D toxicity, while relatively uncommon, represents a real worthwhile risk to understand clearly before you start supplementing on your own. Toxicity typically only occurs with genuinely very high doses sustained over extended periods, well beyond what's found in standard over-the-counter supplements taken exactly as directed on the label. it becomes a considerably more realistic concern, specifically when men happen to be taking multiple different supplements simultaneously without ever tracking their combined total vitamin D content across all of them, or when meaningfully higher dose, prescription strength supplementation isn't being properly monitored through appropriate follow-up blood work over time. Symptoms of genuine toxicity, which stem primarily from the resulting elevated calcium levels in the bloodstream, can include nausea, general weakness, and in more severe, sustained cases, meaningful kidney complications worth taking seriously. This is precisely why testing your levels before you start and retesting periodically once you begin supplementing genuinely matters here, not simply to confirm the supplement is working as intended, but specifically to ensure you're not inadvertently overshooting into a range that creates its own separate set of problems entirely. Vitamin D simply isn't included in most standard annual blood work panels by default, unlike more commonly tested markers such as cholesterol or blood glucose, which get checked routinely as part of a typical general physical exam without anyone needing to specifically request them. Vitamin D testing typically has to be specifically requested either directly by the patient or because a doctor has some particular reason to suspect a deficiency based on presenting symptoms. This straightforward reality means the overwhelming majority of men simply never get tested for this specific nutrient unless they happen to specifically ask. Regardless of how many of the symptoms discussed throughout this video, they might genuinely be experiencing day to day, compounding this considerably. The symptoms associated with vitamin D deficiency, persistent fatigue, low mood, poor sleep quality, and reduced libido all overlap heavily with numerous other common conditions, ranging from low testosterone to depression to simple garden variety overwork and burnout. This significant symptom overlap means both patients themselves and their treating physicians frequently reach for more commonly discussed, more familiar explanations first, sometimes proceeding through fairly extensive additional workups for entirely separate conditions before anyone actually thinks to check something as comparatively simple as vitamin D status specifically. The seasonal pattern, genuinely worth understanding. Vitamin D levels fluctuate meaningfully with the seasons for most men, a pattern that carries genuine practical relevance, particularly if you happen to live somewhere with clearly distinct seasonal changes throughout the year. For most men, vitamin D levels tend to peak toward the end of summer, following several months of considerably greater natural sun exposure, and then gradually decline through fall and winter, often reaching their lowest point sometime in late winter or early spring. This means many of the symptoms discussed throughout this video, persistent fatigue, low mood, disrupted sleep, reduced energy, often genuinely intensify during these exact colder months, and men frequently attribute this seasonal shift to general factors like shorter days or colder weather in general, without ever recognizing that an actual measurable drop in a specific nutrient is contributing meaningfully to how they're feeling. If you've personally noticed a consistent pattern where you tend to feel noticeably worse during winter months specifically, that's genuinely worth testing during that particular seasonal low point directly, rather than only testing during summer months when levels are naturally at their highest and might therefore mask a meaningful deficiency that only becomes clinically significant later in the year. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble nutrient, and this carries a genuinely significant, frequently overlooked implication specifically for men carrying meaningfully excess body fat. Vitamin D tends to get sequestered directly within fat tissue throughout the body, meaning men with higher overall body fat percentages often show measurably lower circulating vitamin D levels in their bloodstream, even when their actual sun exposure and dietary intake are genuinely equivalent to leaner individuals. The vitamin itself isn't being lost or destroyed. It's simply being stored away within fat tissue rather than remaining freely available in the bloodstream where it can actually be utilized by the vascular, hormonal, and neurological systems that depend directly on it functioning properly. This is precisely why addressing overall body composition alongside correcting a specific confirmed vitamin D deficiency often produces meaningfully better, more complete results than addressing either individual factor entirely on its own, bringing everything discussed throughout this video together into one clear practical summary. Vitamin D deficiency is genuinely common among men over 50, driven primarily by reduced natural sun exposure, less efficient skin conversion that comes with age, and modern indoor-heavy lifestyles that most men don't think twice about. Correcting a genuinely confirmed deficiency carries real research support for improved erectile function through better vascular and endothelial health, meaningfully improved energy through both hormonal and cellular mechanisms working together, and genuinely improved sleep quality through vitamin D's direct role in brain regulation of your sleep-wake cycle. This isn't presented as some kind of miracle cure, and it certainly doesn't replace addressing other foundational habits or any underlying medical conditions that might separately be contributing to these same symptoms. Men currently taking blood thinners, managing existing kidney disease, or with any personal history of elevated calcium levels should specifically discuss supplementation directly with their doctor before starting, given the relevant interactions and ongoing monitoring considerations unique to those particular situations. It's worth addressing directly how vitamin D interacts with several medications commonly prescribed to men over 50, since this affects both safety and effectiveness for a meaningful portion of the audience watching this video. Certain cholesterol medications, specifically some statins, can modestly reduce vitamin D absorption, meaning men on these medications may need slightly higher supplementation to reach the same target levels, worth discussing directly with a prescribing doctor rather than assuming a standard dose applies equally to everyone. Certain blood pressure medications, particularly thiazide diuretics, can raise calcium levels when combined with vitamin D supplementation, since both affect calcium regulation through separate but overlapping mechanisms, making this a genuinely important combination to flag with a doctor before starting supplementation independently. Men taking corticosteroids for any chronic condition should be aware these medications are well documented to interfere with vitamin D metabolism directly, often requiring meaningfully higher supplementation to maintain adequate levels. Again, best addressed directly with the prescribing doctor rather than through generic online dosing advice that has no visibility into your specific medication regimen. Something worth understanding clearly when you do get tested. Reference ranges for normal vitamin D levels vary somewhat between laboratories and organizations, and what's considered optimal for general health sometimes differs from what research suggests is optimal specifically for the outcomes discussed throughout this video: erectile function, energy, and sleep. A result that falls within a lab's broad normal range isn't automatically the same as a level that's genuinely optimal for these specific concerns. This is exactly why discussing your actual number directly with your doctor, rather than simply checking whether it falls within a printed reference range, produces a more useful, individualized conversation about whether supplementation makes sense for your specific situation and goals. It's worth mentioning a factor that affects a meaningful portion of the population, but rarely gets discussed clearly. Skin tone directly affects how efficiently the body converts sunlight into vitamin D. Melanin, the pigment responsible for darker skin tones, naturally reduces the skin's efficiency at this specific conversion process, meaning men with darker skin generally require considerably more sun exposure to produce the same amount of vitamin D compared to men with lighter skin tones. Population studies consistently find higher rates of vitamin D deficiency among men with darker skin, specifically independent of the age-related factors already discussed throughout this video. This makes testing particularly worthwhile for this population, rather than assuming adequate sun exposure alone provides sufficient protection against deficiency the way it might for someone with lighter skin. For men who want to support their vitamin D levels through a combination of reasonable sun exposure and supplementation, rather than relying entirely on one approach, it's worth understanding how to think about balancing both sensibly. Brief, moderate sun exposure. Roughly 10 to 15 minutes on exposed skin during midday hours several times weekly during sunnier months can meaningfully contribute to natural production for many men, without requiring the kind of extended, unprotected exposure that meaningfully increases skin cancer risk. This isn't a replacement for supplementation in men with confirmed significant deficiency, but it represents a reasonable complementary habit worth maintaining alongside appropriate supplementation, particularly during the specific months when natural production is most feasible, given your geographic location. I want to close this additional section with a point I think matters more than almost any other specific detail covered throughout this video. The research supporting vitamin D's connection to erectile function, energy, and sleep reflects consistent, sustained correction of a genuine deficiency over months, not occasional or sporadic supplementation, taken only when you happen to remember. Missing a dose occasionally isn't something to worry about excessively, but building this into a genuinely consistent daily habit similar to any other foundational health practice discussed elsewhere on this channel produces meaningfully better, more reliable results than an inconsistent approach where supplementation happens for a week, gets forgotten for 2 weeks, and then resumes sporadically without any real pattern. Men who see genuinely meaningful, lasting improvement across all 3 areas discussed throughout this video are, without real exception, the ones who treated this as a consistent daily habit rather than an occasional afterthought reached for only during a particularly bad week. So here's the bottom line to take away from everything discussed throughout this entire video. Vitamin D deficiency is genuinely common, frequently overlooked by both patients and physicians alike, and correcting it carries real, meaningful research support for erectile function, energy levels, and sleep quality, all 3 simultaneously, rather than representing 3 entirely separate concerns requiring 3 entirely separate solutions. 3 practical takeaways worth carrying forward from everything covered today. Get an actual blood test rather than simply guessing at your vitamin D status based on symptoms alone. Choose the D3 form specifically and take it alongside a meal containing some dietary fat to meaningfully improve absorption. And retest your levels after roughly 2 to 3 months of consistent supplementation to genuinely confirm it's actually working as intended rather than just assuming. If this video addressed something you genuinely wondered about but never had explained clearly before, that's exactly why this content exists in the first place. The Iron Age Guide is linked directly with this video if you're looking for that broader, more comprehensive framework. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.